So there is a rent control ballot initiative where they're basically trying to attempt to repackage a bad idea and turn it into an even worse idea, if you could believe it or not. And not only that, by the way, but these people, what they want to do here is they want it to pass immediately. They want it to pass before you guys could even know that it passed. They're effectively trying to force it down the throats of the legislature and strong arm them to a position where this passes before July 1st. So, first of all, I know rents. This is a rent control video, and I do know rents are extremely high in Massachusetts. It sucks. They're genuinely too high. The cost of real estate is too high. The cost of renting is too high. It's absolutely brutal. I could level with you there, right? It absolutely sucks. When you have a one bedroom in Boston that's like $3,400 a month or something, yeah, it's absolutely ludicrous because we have, working class people here, or people that grew up here, people who have jobs here, and they are getting priced out of the cities that they grew up in, right? They may have been here their whole lives and they can't even afford to rent anymore in the same city that they grew up in. So I understand completely, and I can also understand why people look at rent control and they say, hey, this looks like a good idea, right? So if you're angry about it, right? If you're angry about the cost of housing or the cost of rent here, that's fine, right? But the problem isn't the anger, right? A lot of people will position their anger at, let's say, the developers or the contractors, whatever it may be, right? I don't think you're really positioning it in the right direction. I know that's the path of least resistance, but what's happening now is that it's coming from the same administration. Beacon Hill is out here trying to sell you a solution. So the Fiscal Alliance Foundation, there was a report that came out today, okay? And it came out about rent control. And they really touched on some points that even I wasn't thinking about initially. I filmed a video about rent control a couple days ago, and then, I may or may not have known something was coming along the way, and I waited until this dropped. So here's what nobody ever tells you about rent control. It doesn't actually fix the problem, right? It doesn't fix the problem in the first place because the rents are high because there's not enough places to live. This is a basic supply and demand thing. You could try to flip it any way you want. You could do any level of mental gymnastics that you want. It's a supply and demand problem. Massachusetts is terrible when it comes to building. They have been for decades. And you got to realize these people in Beacon Hill, they have thrown up every single regulatory roadblock, red tape, whatever you want to call it, that makes building new units either too expensive, too slow, or basically impossible to the point that investors and investment groups don't want to even invest here. They don't want to build here. So that results in, guess what? Less supply. All you need to do is go and look, if you don't believe me, go and look at the historical permitting data to figure it out, and you'll see it plain as day. So what happens is, without the lack of construction, the building supply stays limited, but the demand grows. The demand grows because we do have job opportunities here for some people, and we do have a lot of colleges here. So that demand for the lack of supply causes rents to go up. It's just basic economics. That's all that it is. But rent control does not fix this problem at all. It actually makes this problem even worse, right? Because when you start to cap the existing rental supply, then predictably what happens is the supply starts to disappear because there's a couple dynamics that happen here. You got to realize that landlords end up converting their multifamily homes into condos, right? And they'll sell the condos. They don't want to deal with the rent control, right? Or they'll stop maintaining their properties altogether. Think about what happened on Symphony Road in Fenway, okay? They burned the damn places down. Rent control wasn't the only reason, but it was certainly one of the reasons. Or they just don't even put the properties on the market in the first place. So what happens is the housing supply ends up shrinking. And the people that needed the affordable housing or the rent control the most, they end up with fewer options, not more. We know this because Massachusetts, they already ran this experiment. We ran this experiment numerous times, okay? We had rent control and it failed, right? We ended up repealing it like what, 2 or 3 times. And the last time was in 1994, where the voters here in Massachusetts, they killed it. They saw what was going on in Cambridge. They saw what was going on in Brookline, and they saw what was going on. I think it was Somerville, if I'm not mistaken. And they said, this is a bad idea, right? All you need to do is look at the historical data of what happened to the properties that were rent-controlled units in Cambridge, and they lost like 45 to 50% of their value compared to non-rent-controlled units, okay? And you might be thinking to yourself, well, Mike, we need properties to come down in value. I'll get to that, okay? I will eventually get to that. So you need to remember something here. These people they like to fire from the hip, right? Nobody likes to mention the history, especially if it's bad history, when it comes to these ballot initiatives or ballot measures, right? They just don't want to because it looks terrible. So instead, you as the, let's say, resident of this state, you're getting bombarded with TV ads or whatever it may be, yard signs, whatever it is, right? And everybody thinks that, and to a point, they're right, where corporate landlords are a problem. And I don't disagree with that at all in any which way. Something needs to be done here. But that something is not this. I have a couple of ideas that I have in my brain, not fully fleshed out, but I do have ideas to try to fix the problem, starting with building more supply. That's for another video. But look, if you look at it this way, if you're already a renter and you're living in a rent-controlled unit, right, then what ends up happening is these people don't leave. This is why it creates an even more lack of supply. On top of that, what ended up happening, and this is per the report too, people of color occupied only 12% of the rent-controlled units, despite making up 24% of the population in rent-controlled cities. So the people that these type of things are meant to benefit ends up flowing to people on higher income or stable tenants that don't want to move now in the first place, that may have been thinking about moving because their rent just got a decrease, right? That's the truth. So the people that actually need the units don't end up getting them. That's realistically what happens here. So the people don't want to lose their rent-controlled protected units. That's what happens. So they stay and they don't leave, which means less units effectively come on the market. That's another reason why, okay? So rent control ends up not protecting the most, let's say, vulnerable of renters. But what it does do is it protects whoever already has the apartment rented and can continue to afford it. And of course, they can continue to afford it now because now their rent is capped. It's even lower. Does that make sense? So basically, anyone who's already renting and just thinking about moving, they get incentivized to stay. That's it. And this is not a Mike Urban theory or something like that. That's what data shows. You could look at other areas to see rent control has not worked in anywhere in the entire world. It's never worked. I wish something would work, not necessarily pertaining to rent control. Something needs to be done here. But again, this is not the answer. Now, on to part two. Let's talk about part two. And this is what a lot of this report irons out. This is something that I didn't even think about. And it's how your properties get taxed, okay? And this applies to people who aren't even renters or renting their unit. This is the part of the story that absolutely, to my opinion, nobody was really even talking about. So, but they will be, especially after this report, at least in my opinion. And it's this. It's the effects of your unit, whether it be a single family home, whatever it is, something that you're living in that is not rent controlled. You may have never even rented a day in your life. Your property, the taxes on your property, they end up going up. And I'm going to explain why. But first, let me explain how we got here, all right? The original ballot measure, the one that was heading for vote in November, this coming November, this is going to raise your taxes. It's not a maybe. It's not a possibility. This is an absolute guarantee. It's an automatic guarantee as a direct result of the, you got to think about how they structure the taxes here. The mathematical result of how Massachusetts law, especially when it comes to assessments, works. And here's how it works. I'm going to make this as simple as humanly possible. So when a town needs to figure out how much of an apartment building is worth for tax purposes, they are not just guessing. They look at how much rent that building is collecting. They look at what is called the net operating income. You have your gross operating income, then you have your net operating income, which is after your expenses. Think of it like this. If you own a business and that business makes a lot of money, it's inevitably worth a lot of money. But if that same business makes not a lot of money, it's going to be worth less money. It's pretty simple. So even you could boil this down to even think about the banks that are writing loans on these type of properties. The appraisers don't only look at the real estate value for an investment property. They are also looking at capitalization rates. They're looking at the net operating income of these properties to determine a valuation. So here's what happens, right? The apartment buildings work exactly the same way. When you have more rent coming in, the higher the value is going to be on paper. With the less rent coming in, the lower the value is going to be on paper. So if this passes statewide day one, your property is going to inevitably be worth less money. So that's what's going to happen. Because when you pass a law capping what a landlord could charge, that building is automatically going to be worth less, not only in the eyes of a potential buyer, but in the eyes of the assessor's office for tax purposes, and also in the eyes of an appraiser or a lender that's looking to finance the property. That's the truth. That is what happens. So, look at it this way. No town official is going to sit down and say, you know what, let's lower the building's value. That doesn't just happen. The math does this automatically. But here's what you probably don't know about Massachusetts, right? They end up kind of putting apartment buildings and single family homes in the same tax bucket or the same tax category. For instance, you could have a single family home that's on your street that you live in as a primary residence. You could have another single family home across the street that is being used as a rental property. So what ends up happening is when these rented units, right, when they inevitably drop in value, right, inside of that specific bucket, your town still needs to collect the same amount of money to pay the bills of the town. Do you see where I'm going here? So you got to figure teachers, roads, fire, police, whatever it may be, they still need to be funded. So what happens next is that the tax rate ends up going up to cover the gap. And your house, which again could be a single family home, you may not even have a mortgage on the damn place, it's not potentially going to drop in value. It's also not potentially going to grow in value, and it doesn't matter either way, right? But what will inevitably happen is that your property is going to represent a bigger piece of the pie or a bigger piece of that bucket that it's in. So your tax bill will inevitably go up. So, and remember, your tax bill is going up for a landlord-tenant policy that has absolutely nothing to do with you. It's another form of robbing Peter to pay Paul situation. And as I said, the Fiscal Alliance Foundation published a study exactly on this. I'll actually link this in the description below. So just for a quick example, just to give you an idea, I'm probably not going to share the slides on the screen. I really don't feel like editing and I'm pressed for time today. But from memory, if you have a property that's worth about 660 grand, right? You're only looking at about a $312 increase per year in property taxes, which is $660K is like a statewide number, right? Now, I know that $312, that may not sound like a lot of money. It doesn't sound catastrophic. That's 100% true. But when you run it out over time, like over 10 years, that's almost $2,600. But over, let's say, the life of your loan, let's say you bought a house and you're going to live in this house 100% for 30 years, it's going to cost you an additional $18,700. That is a lot of money. And I know what you're probably thinking, Mike, how did you get like that much money from a $312 a month times 30? Well, it doesn't really work that way, right? Because property taxes don't stay flat. So it's almost like a compounding issue. Your property taxes go up every year. So you're not paying the same exact amount annually because that number continues to grow over time as the base keeps rising. So one year it might be 312. The next year it might be 410. The year after that it might be 640. Do you see where I'm going here? And that's how you would get to that $18,700 number. And again, this is a direct result of nothing that you did. This is for a landlord-tenant policy that has absolutely nothing to do with you. And that's just one example. That's statewide. But when you quantify it down, or let's say put a magnifying glass on specific markets, you could look no other than Boston, right? The estimate for Boston per year is closer to $1,100. So calculate that on top of increasing tax bases over the course of 30 years. I didn't really do that math here, but it's a lot more than $18,700. That's what I'm trying to say. It's a huge portion of the pie. And finally, this is the last thing. I know this is a long video, guys, but this is the last thing I kind of want to talk about here. Over the weekend, the coalition that is trying to pass the rent control, they end up meeting with developers. And just Tuesday, you may have seen this, you may not have, but just Tuesday of this week, this went public. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to create a compromise. I call it containment. I call it a trap. That's what it is. And here's what I'm worried about here. So a new version of this statewide mandate, this statewide mandate that was originally intended. Now what they're trying to do is, instead of make it a statewide mandate, they're trying to have individual municipalities and cities and towns, right? They could control whether to opt in or opt out. Now on paper, that might sound okay. All right, that might sound okay, but hear me out here. On top of that, they also increased the cap. So originally, the statewide mandate was inflation or 5%, whichever was lower. The new version allows inflation plus an extra 5% on top of that, including something called a vacancy reset, which is pretty simple. It just means when a tenant moves out of the property, the landlord could bring the rent back to whatever the market will bear before the cap kicks in again, and for the next tenant. That's all that is. And as I said, on paper, because when I saw this originally, I'm like, this doesn't seem too bad to me. But then I started to think about it, and I'll explain why. The vacancy reset alone removed one of the most destructive pieces of the original proposal, which got me thinking, right? I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, God, they went from one extreme to the other that's not necessarily in their benefit, right? And they're also allowing the landlord to make more money. They're allowing him to make more money so he has more, or they have more room for maintenance costs, taxes, inflation, whatever it may be, right? And because historically these properties deteriorate, all you need to do is, look throughout time in history and you'll come to the same conclusion. But here's what I found really, really strange, okay? Mayor Wu was one of the first and loudest voices of rent control. She's a massive fan of rent control, and she's been kind of bringing it up since 2023. She endorsed this version immediately, which set me back a little bit because I'm thinking to myself, this is somebody that wants rent control throughout the entire state. Why would she compromise for something this suspicious to me? This is suspicious to me is what I'm trying to say. Because think about what the local option would actually create. Let's say Boston opts in, Cambridge opts in, Somerville opts in. These are the progressive cities that have been pushing this for years, right? For years. And in 1 year, maybe 2 years, rents stabilize, let's say, in those cities, right? It looks fine on a surface level. It looks fine in the short term, right? But the deeper damage, which is, let's say the shrinking supply, right? The rising homeowner taxes, meaning if you're a single family homeowner, it's your primary residence, your taxes are going to go up. And the landlords that are looking to convert their rent controlled units into condos, all of that stuff on the back end will play out slowly, specific to those regions, okay? You end up having short-term gains for a longer-term loss over the years. But by the time the damage is fully visible, you've got thousands of tenants in those cities who are currently benefiting from the cap. And the moment anyone tries to repeal it or points the finger at this, guess what happens? It creates an opportunity for the advocates to point to those tenants and say, do you want to take this away? Do you want us to take this away from you? Well, the reality is this creates even more roadblocks because you can't. Politically, you can't. They're building a constituency of protected people in specific cities who will fight to repeal within those cities with everything that they have. And meanwhile, the towns that opted out, they're going to be completely fine because they don't have rent control. They didn't opt into it, which again, sounds good, but just hear me out. Here's what happens, okay? And this is the argument that I'm trying to make here. If this fails, let's say in Boston, but Holden doesn't have rent control and it's fine, and Beacon Hill has the opportunity to say, well, the program is working in some places. Let's just study this more. Basically, what I'm trying to say here is that it supplies them more ambiguity, and they have another opportunity to kick the can down the road even further, because the ambiguity where you have one town opting in, one town not, another 2 towns opting in, another 3 towns not. It creates so much confusion in the marketplace that they're more than likely going to study it again. They're going to run another commission. They'll issue another report, and it's not going to ever go away. It provides them with more time and more opportunities to study this damn thing. So I think the statewide ballot measure, and you could disagree with me on this, but I spent a lot of time thinking on this. I think the statewide ballot measure is actually a cleaner version to fight on. Because if it's passed, and hear me out, because if the statewide version, not the specific town or city or municipality opt-in version, if the statewide version passed statewide, it also has the opportunity to fail statewide. Do you see what I'm saying? And it will, right? Because every city that has ever tried this has failed, right? So you would end up getting a statewide verdict. You would have a clean level of data, you would have clear damage, and you would have a real path to repeal it because it is statewide. That's what I think. I think that the developers are missing here, because from what I was reading, they're kind of on board with this version. And I realize, I could go down, I don't want to yap forever, but I could go down a rabbit hole here. But I do realize that you guys, the developers, could win in markets that aren't currently rent controlled, and maybe make some money off of those markets. But I really think you're missing the forest for the trees here. Now, you could still run a statewide repeal ballot the same way that Massachusetts killed rent control in 1994. I think that that's still a possibility. Meaning if that this is on a per town basis or mandated per town, per city, whatever, I think you could still do it on a technicality. Like technically you could still do it, right? The mechanism still exists on paper. But think about who you were actually asking to vote. In 1994, rent control existed. Again, it was Boston, Cambridge, and not Somerville. I think it was Boston, Cambridge, and Brookline. Those were the 3 markets. And it failed miserably enough that the voters across the entire state looked at the damage in those 3 areas and said, you know what? We don't like the way this is going. We need to get rid of this. And it was one statewide vote. It was done. The damage was concentrated. It was undeniable. And the political coalition to kill it existed because everyone could see what was happening. This was killed in part with SPOA, the Small Property Owners Association. They were the big advocates for removing rent control in general. So they did a fantastic job back in the 90s. Now under the local option, look at it this way. If this passes, you've got a completely different set of problems because the towns that opted in have 2 groups fighting each other. The tenant that's benefiting from the cap and the homeowner picking up the slack, getting hit with the higher tax bills. Now, the towns that opted out are completely fine. Their markets are still working. So look at it this way. Why would a voter in Holden or Sandwich go to the polls to repeal something that doesn't affect them? It doesn't affect them because it has yet to be mandated in their town. That's the main part of the problem, by the way. So that coalition that made 1994 work, at least in my opinion, simply does not exist, or it will be harder to exist in this patchwork system. Because it provides an opportunity for Beacon Hill to hide. It provides an opportunity for Beacon Hill to point at the towns that opted out and say something like, see, like it works in some places. Let's just study this damn thing more. And look, I want to be clear about something here. I'm not rooting for a statewide version to pass, okay? I am absolutely not rooting for a statewide version to pass. But if the option is between a statewide version, which in my opinion will be much easier to repeal, versus a convoluted patchwork system that they will continue to patch and not repeal, I would opt for the statewide version. I would rather, what's the phrase, eat the frog or something like that, right? Where you do the hardest thing first. That's all I'm trying to say here. But overall, I don't want anything to pass. Okay, that's what I'm trying to advocate for. I'm really rooting so that this thing doesn't pass. But again, the statewide version of rent control and the damage that it would cause would be visible everywhere simultaneously. Every homeowner in every city and town would feel it in their tax bill at the same time. As long as you're not one of the units that is rent controlled, because you're covering the slack for the gap in the tax collected from those units that are declining in value. And every landlord in every market would be making the same decision at the same time. I think that that level of evidence that it doesn't work wouldn't be as easily buried in, like, by the city or explained anyway by pointing at a town that opted out. That's what I'm trying to say here, because it would be statewide. It would be undeniable. It would almost be impossible to spin it any other way. And that's what creates enough political conditions for a clean statewide repeal. Because remember, every corner of Massachusetts at that time, if it's statewide, would have skin in the game, because you don't even have the opportunity to opt out of the program. For all that you know, it could be coming to a town or a city or a municipality near you. So if the opportunity arises itself that all of these towns are failing, right? There's clear evidence of data, you will have a clear path to repealing it. That's what I'm trying to say. That's how you build a coalition big enough to actually kill it. The local option flips that entirely because the damage stays concentrated in the cities that opted in, but the rest of the state is watching from the sidelines, right? And you will never, I promise you this, you will never ever get a clean verdict that this works, okay? If this is a patchwork system. You see what I'm saying here? Ever. A statewide failure is painful, but a statewide failure is fixable. A patchwork failure is designed to be permanent because it could be patched. You see where I'm going here? That's the issue. That's why I'm more worried about the compromise than the original ballot measure itself. And I really think that these developers that may have went to this meeting, I don't know if they were thinking about it. Maybe they went in thinking about their pockets and not necessarily about it in this perspective. And I'm not condemning you guys, by the way. I respect you guys, but I just want to put this out there because I don't think anybody else has talked about this, because this isn't a compromise, as I said before. I think this is realistically a trap. It's rent control optimized for political survival. That's why even the advocates of the original mandate, where it was going to be statewide, why the hell would they cave to this? Why would they cave to this and then put a strong arm value on of July 1st of when they wanted to pass by, right? They want to get it into law in the books as fast as possible, and they want to plan it in enough cities and towns to build a protected voter base and wait for the damage to become too complicated to ever fully reverse. That's what I think is going on here. Anyway, I'll stop yapping, but that's my take on this. I know quite a bit about rent control, and this video, it's almost 30 minutes long. I'm so sorry. I could talk forever about rent control because I know quite a bit about it. But ultimately, just go look at the records. It just doesn't work. Something needs to be done. I am an advocate for lowering the costs, but we can't do it this way. That's what I'm trying to say. So anyway, that's it for today's video, guys. I'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.